Welcome to the Jaron Jarvis channel. I am Jaron Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, we failed to conceive a child, my wife starts to tell other children to die, killed a dog, and other incidents. Dear Edit. What I am about to tell you, I have never told anyone else before. The only people who know of this story is me and my wife. After 5 years of what I call the incident, or more appropriately, the series of incidents, I decided that with the permission of my wife, I will be slowly breaking the news to others, in hopes that people who may have suffered a similar loss be comforted in knowing the fact that they are not alone. Well, where to start? I suppose we'll go about 5 years back. Imagine of a woman, whose smile stretched out like a vast ocean, with eyes that glimmered like the stars. I swore that her laughter eliminated every disease. Her name's Catherine, and marrying her was. It was like winning the lotto, except Catherine's worth to me was more than any amount of money, in any currency, in the world. You could offer me all the wealth and riches in the universe to leave her and I wouldn't hesitate to decline it. I'm sorry if that's a little sappy for you to read, but I could not tell you the story without first describing the goddess she is. I love her very much, and I am grateful for every single second that we spend together. Nearly 6 years ago, back in summer, we decided that we were finally ready to start a family. Even before we were married, she was already rabbiting about having children, wanting a beautiful daughter or a handsome boy, maybe even multiples of them. I have to admit, I was also a little influenced by her excitement, but we both understood that at that time, we were in no way ready to have kids. Moreover, her family was a little more on the traditional side, marriage first, then children. So we waited. We threw our hearts into it without a second thought. Even before we confirmed that the bun was in the oven, she was already browsing through catalogs of baby-related things, excitedly dragging me into IKEA to look at possible wallpapers, cots, even at bedsheet patterns. She even carried around the pregnancy test, sometimes staring at it minutes at a time, waiting for the time she would finally use it and confirm whether she was conceiving. And we were successful. I could not forget the look on her face when she broke the news. At that time, I was working night shifts, so I came home when the sun was about to rise. As soon as I stepped one foot into the house, I was met with my bright-eyed Catherine, delightedly yelling about a little us growing in her stomach. As it turned out, she had been staying up all night waiting for me to come home and break the news. She was an artist at that time, selling off her works in a little gallery. You could see that the idea of having a child was quickly integrating into her work. She painted ducklings, kittens, cygnets, puppies, even human babies sometimes if she fancied it, with their mothers. Whenever she was not painting, she stacked paper catalogs and scrolled through them before cutting certain objects out. Then, with a glue stick, she would carefully set them down on a scrapbook, each page a different design of a baby's bedroom. She would then sit down with me and she'd show every single page, asking me which one I preferred. I would tell her that every single one was beautiful and unique, and that I meant it with sincerity. Sadly, our happiness was short-lived. Catherine had a miscarriage. When she learnt of it, she looked as if someone ran her over with a vacuum and sucked her soul. She wandered around the house like a ghost, carrying her little scrapbook, flipping through every page and stroking every cutout she made, tracing her fingers across the baby names that she came up with and scribbled at the back of her book. We could always try again, I said to her, as means of comfort, but she looked aghast when I said it. This was what I was afraid of, that she would take the death of the blob of jelly inside her to heart. I suppose everyone's got their own point of view whether the baby's alive at the time of conceiving, sometime after or when it's born, but to my wife, the miscarriage was like a death of a child. It was as if I said we could simply replace it, which, to her, wasn't the same. Thankfully, Catherine bounced back from it fairly quickly, and we tried again. She was again back to her old self, writing even more names on the back of her scrapbook, and she went out to buy another book to design other sorts of bedrooms. This time, she was even more meticulous, buying all sorts of washi tape and patterned cards, cutting them and sticking them together to make cots, toys, wallpapers and carpets to stick into her book. Once I jokingly suggested that she should propose them to interior design retailers. She quickly snatched the book away from sight, muttering that these designs were special for our child. Unfortunately, the child we dream of, it never came. We failed again. We tried again, and again, and again, but it was as if someone out there was simply willing for the child in my wife's womb to vanish. We tried things that could boost our chances, meds, hormone shots, meds with hormone shots. And every time, whenever we felt like a pregnancy was going to stick around, whenever we felt we were so close to simply waiting just for a few months for a baby boy or a baby girl, it slips away, right through our fingers, and I'd watch my wife in her hysterics inside the bathroom, blood and blobs of jelly staining her thighs. Blobs of jelly that simply couldn't stick inside her long enough to grow. We could always go for fostering or adoption. It's a sad common last resort, since most would want a blood child, and although Catherine considered it, she was so upset over the failures of her pregnancy. I could see it in her eyes. I saw a woman desperate to be a mother, but was never granted the privilege to do so. I saw a woman that seemed as if she watched too many deaths, too many dead souls, so many miseries that she herself became grey like gravestones. Over time, I could see that Catherine just wasn't Catherine anymore. We continued trying, of course, but each time it failed, everything became a tad more dreadful. I would come home from my night shifts and Catherine would be there, painting. I was used to this, because she was the kind of woman who would stay up to finish her work, but she began to paint. Just things that were awful to look at. One time I came home to her painting, to an explicit detail, of a woman with the contents of her stomach sprawled out. Then there was that one painting with a stillborn baby's head squeezing out between a mother's legs. Then there were things so horrible, so mortifyingly appalling that I'm afraid words are waste to describe how morbid they were. We tried IVF. To our joy, it seemed as if this one was sticking around after all. In fact, it had even progressed to my wife getting a little bump. It was the slightest, tiniest bump, but no doubt, it was our child growing inside Catherine. I suppose you could guess why the above paragraph was a little short. We didn't succeed. Catherine was wailing, days on end, blaming herself, blaming the fact that she couldn't conceive a child, blaming that she didn't eat the correct diet, came in contact with too many cats. I wondered where this one came from, blaming her mother for passing on such crappy fertility, questioning what we could have done better, done different, not do. I started hiding her paints to prevent her from depicting her anguish on canvases, and I hid her finished works because they were too horrible to look at. I wish I could have hid her scrapbooks sooner too, because she started to design bedrooms where the cots were broken apart, or the baby was dead inside the cot, or there was blood all over the furniture, or that wasn't the end of it, either. She started this habit of breaking eggs. When I came home there'd be yolk all over the front yard, pieces of eggshells on the grass, and I'd look up to see my wife just mindlessly smashing them into the floor. If she'd done it with a smile I thought she'd been playing a game. We all get weird impulses sometimes, although this one was especially weird, but there just this look on her face, something like you'd see on a beast, or Jack in Lord of the Flies, something like a shadow, some sort of bloody intent. I immediately dropped my bags and I embraced her, asking her what was wrong. You know what an anglerfish looks like? It's those fish with big jaws and lamps hanging atop of their heads. I'm sure you've seen it in Nemo somewhere. Their eyes are tiny, but they bulge out in a horrible way, as if they're about to pop out. Their mouth just takes up their whole face, and you could see their teeth, tongue and everything, even so far up to the back of their throats. My wife looked just like that, like some sort of horrid creature, with her mouth agape and snarling, eyes bulging out of her sockets, except it was a human face and that she was smashing eggs at the same time, stepping onto the eggshells for a good measure. She screamed out the answer to my question, rather gutturally, that she was smashing those eggs before they'd hatch into chicks, so they couldn't live. I could understand agony over miscarriage, but I could not understand smashing eggs that clearly will not hatch into chicks because they're not fertilized, they've been refrigerated, and that's simply the nature of law, they'll never hatch. I told her this, that it's impossible for store-bought eggs to hatch. She croaked something that sounded like good, and then she just kept doing it. But you and I know that she didn't smash eggs for that reason. It was her way of saying, if she couldn't have a baby, then nobody else can. I told her to get help. I told her we could contact services, counseling, anything that could make her feel better. She told me, with a voice that sounded like sandpaper, that if anything would make her feel better, it would be a baby growing in her stomach. I should have realized that her obsession with conceiving a child was spiraling out of control. One day at work, I was called home with concerns regarding my wife. Immediately, I thought of the worst possible scenarios. Had she harmed herself? Suicide? I tried to keep a calm mind, because I wasn't getting called to a hospital and I was called home, and the other person on the line said she wasn't hurt. When I pulled up, I saw a cop car parked outside the house and I thought, oh no. Sure enough, there's 2 police officers inside the house, and my wife sat rigid, as if she was aghast. One officer told me that my wife was spotted going round to the nearby nursery, shouting to the children that played outside, screaming you shouldn't exist. Or go back into your mother's womb and perish. Or die. 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 What the police officers were here for was for the fact that my wife had walked into that nursery with a bat of some sort, encountered a pregnant woman picking up her other child, and Catherine had smashed her bat onto the woman's stomach, like a piñata, willing for the growing child inside to burst and come out. To say that I was horrified was an understatement. Catherine, however, looked as if she was near tears. I didn't know whether that was from in fear of getting jailed, or that she was genuinely guilty. She sobbed to me, apologizing over and over again, repeating that she just wanted a baby and it was so unfair others could have it and she could not. The officers were a little stunned at this point, and only spoke again when Catherine's muffled sobs subsided. They said that they won't press charges, because the pregnant woman didn't want to, and I was relieved at the assurance that she was okay and there was no major harm done, but Catherine was getting a caution, and that the next time she does something drastic, it would be taken much more seriously. She wearily agreed. The officers sorted out their things and they advised us to seek someone that could help her. Then they left. Catherine, holding her precious scrapbook, apologized to me, promising that she wouldn't do it again. In a span of just a few years, it seemed as if she'd aged a decade. There were grays in her hair, her eyes sunk into her sockets, and she was so frail and brittle in her frame. I forgave her, in the condition that she would seek help. She nodded and she didn't argue it any further. She broke her promise just a few days afterwards. Our neighbor has quite a few dogs. They're quite sweet dogs, and I'd spot them leaning onto the fence around the afternoon when I'd leave for work. I remember giving them hearty pets, and they'd bark in unison as my car drove off, as if to say goodbye. Now it's not my business whether a dog gets pregnant or not, because it's a negligible fact and I could care less, but I came out of the house one day to see a neighbor weeping at the front yard, cradling one of her dogs. It's quite a big dog, a female Rottweiler, but by the looks of it, the animal was limp, and it looked like someone tore open the dog's stomach and ripped whatever was inside of it to shreds. The contents looked like as if it was fresh from being blended, before being poured out into the yard. The rest of the dogs were whining. The woman was visibly upset. I thought that it wouldn't hurt to drop by and give her a few words of consolation. I tried not to heave at the sight and smell. I patted the woman's shoulder, and said that they were such good dogs and that it was terrible someone had done this. I presumed it wasn't the other 2 dogs that have done the deed, since they had no blood near their paws or mouth. My neighbor thanked me, and tearily sighed that her dog was pregnant, too, and it was such a horrid thing to happen to such a lovely creature. At the mention of the dog being pregnant, I was reminded of something, and my stomach churned. Do you know who did this? I asked her tentatively. The woman sniffed and sighed. I wish I knew. She ran before I could get a glimpse of her. She? Yes, a woman, she said, before she gulped and looked at me, and I'm so sorry to say this, but it looked like, from the behind, I thought it was your wife. I didn't bother finishing the sentence. I immediately skidded out of the woman's yard and ran into my own house. To my unfortunate expectations, I witnessed her washing blood off her hands in the kitchen sink, and she shrieked when she saw me and threw her hands up in the air. She was caught red-handed, quite literally, and I wanted nothing more to yell at her for being such an incompetent, cruel human being. I'm sorry, I'm just, she broke into sobs, and it shattered my heart to see her like this, but my sympathy was running thin. I just think it's unfair that even animals have better chances of conceiving a child than me, and then, I don't know what came over me, and now, I love Catherine, and I would not, ever, lay a hand on her. However, this was just proving too much for me, and I grabbed her wrists. I shouted at her that she was getting help, right this second, and I made her wash her hands and change her clothes before forcing her into the car, driving her to the docks. Looking back now, I recognized that I had been a little cruel, overreacting perhaps, but I could not grasp the mindset she had, that if she suffered, others must suffer. In the car, I yelled at her for being unreasonable, so filled up with cruel intent, all because she couldn't grow a bloody baby. I had only softened when she remained silent, and admitted that she'd been on the wrong before breaking down into tears again. At the red lights, I couldn't stay mad at her. I embraced her. We filled up forms. We set an appointment. She'd see someone every week or so. I took time off work that day, and slept with my wife. She needed to be comforted, and I do it as much as possible. Perhaps we should get a break on this whole baby thing, just so she can recover, and she agreed. She stopped the paintings. She stopped the scrapbooks. I took a leave from my job so I could keep an eye on her for a bit. I think it was for the better because she did improve in her state. Her skin started glowing again. Her eyes glittered once more. I could definitely tell that she was happier once more, and told her that maybe sometime later, we'll try again, and if that doesn't work, we'll start looking into fostering or adoption. She smiled and nodded. Well, I thought she recovered, anyway. Technically, she did. But I found out her horrible coping mechanisms. I started going to work again, night shifts. I usually slept until 12 p.m. after I come home, go about my day and then go to work once more. I'd be so tired after work that I'd slept through the day like a rock, and I wouldn't wake up even if a bang played at full swing next to me. Lately, while asleep, I started hearing voices. First, I thought Catherine had guests over, which was a good thing since she'd almost lost contact with everyone else during her baby obsession. When I went downstairs to greet the supposed guests, there were none, so I went back to sleep. Then it went on and I realized that they were children's voices. I dismissed them as kids playing outside around this time, but it soon dawned on me that they were coming from inside the house. I thought I was going mad. Maybe Catherine's baby obsession was affecting me, too, some sort of psychosis slowly inhibiting within me. What made matters worse was that the voices, although in multiples, they repeated the exact same thing, in their little monotone, wheezing voice. Mama, feed me. Mama, I love you. Mama, I want to go to bed. Mama, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. The thing is, they all sounded like they were dying, like a moaning ghost, or when a toy ran out low battery and the voice just starts getting distorted, ghastly and wheezing. It sounded as if I heard these voices ascending directly from hell. It felt as if whatever kind of children they were slowly creeping up on me, grappling their little squirmy fingers on my shoulder, announcing, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. We're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. We're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. We're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. "I know, my dearest, I know," something, or someone else, said. My eyes flew open. It was Catherine's voice. I threw the blankets off and I stormed downstairs. I was both mortified and shocked with what I saw. It was just so bizarre. There was Catherine, surrounded by her paintings, her scrapbook open as if it was the Bible. The way the chairs were arranged would make you think it was a cult. She was topless, and she cradled what looked like a jar next to her left breast, nursing it as if she was breastfeeding it. I looked around and noticed that there were multiple jars, nested up on the chairs. By Catherine's side, there was her laptop with what looked like a playing audio on repeat, and the sound began to dampen with my thoughts, and it continued chanting, "We're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive." What was inside the jars? I couldn't tell, but with a closer look, I felt like fainting. Inside the jars were what looked like blobs of red, like jelly. Then I realized that they were bean-shaped, suspended in almost clear liquid, of what I assumed to be preservatives. They were, holy fuck, they were embryos, some of them dismembered, some of them simply just disintegrated blobs. A few of them were bigger than the other, and some of them were just blobs of shapeless red. If I looked any closer then I would be able to see the rough shape of an unborn child, just so dead. Catherine was nursing one of these jars, her breast prodding the glass. She was nursing them, rocking them back and forth, and I could hear the liquid slosh every time she moved it back and forth, along with the repetitive chanting of "We're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive." "What in the fuck's name?" I began. Then my voice just stopped there when Catherine looked at me. All this time, when she miscarried, she kept whatever discharge came out of her. And she preserved them in the fucking jars. And I never fucking knew. Catherine. What the fuck? What the fuck? I kept repeating, blending in with the ghostly moans of "We're alive." Catherine seemed to be in a trance then, but when she saw my face, she was almost as aghast as I was. She shrank, covering her bare chest with the jar and trying to shift the chairs away from my view, but it was too late. I saw it all. And she'd been doing it while I was asleep. It was too bizarre for me to grasp, too unreal, too morbid. At another glance where my eyes landed on one of her gruesome paintings, I heaved and ran back upstairs. And I was wrong to assume that it was all a dream, because when I woke up once more, Catherine was still there with all of her failed children in jars, taking turns in nursing them back and forth, playing different audios, reading them all stories, calling them by names. At this point, I was at a loss of what to do. I sat in the corner of the room, watching her do this all day and all night. She cooed at the jars, stroking them and handling them as you would a newborn, but once in a while I could catch her eyes fearfully look at me, as if she was afraid of me, or herself, or whatever she was doing. But she didn't stop. And it kept going like that, her sitting on the chair with her breasts dangling from her chest, nursing her jars, lulling them to the sounds of "We're alive." I stared at maybe a dozen of those jars, with those beady red blobs looking at me. At one point or another I just started to groan, tears pouring out of my eyes, watching Catherine take care of her children. What snapped us out of this trance was my phone ringing, surprisingly still alive after a few days. When I picked it up, it was Catherine's doctor, wondering why we haven't attended our appointment, and that if we missed the rescheduled one we'd be kicked off the referral. That phone call snapped something inside of me. I got up and felt the filth that caked my body during the couple of days crack. I pushed aside Catherine's canvases and kicked away the chairs, snatching a jar right out of her hands. Before she had a chance to take her jar back, I swerved away from her, but my hand hit one of her tall canvases and my fingers slipped, the jar falling to the floor with a tremendous bash. The jar shattered into a million pieces, like how a little egg cell would infinitely divide when fertilized. Except that the jar wouldn't form something beautiful, something alive. It simply caused Catherine to shriek, running over to the broken jar, picking up the dead blob of jelly. "How dare you! How dare you!" she screeched, throwing shards of glass at me. At this point she was no longer Catherine, nor was she my wife, she was a rabid dog, seething at me for touching her offspring, her teeth bared and her eyes bulging out. She realized what she'd done, and she broke into tears, and suddenly she was more human than a dog, holding the blob of jelly in her palm against her breast, as if trying to feed the thing. She just cried and cried and cried, and at one point she crudely took off whatever clothes she had left and she sat on the chair, spreading her legs. At this point I really didn't know what to expect, but I screamed in horror as she attempted to shove the blob of jelly inside her, between her legs, right where you might expect it. She tried to push it in, as if the body would somehow accept it once more and grow into a flourishing child. But it all came out, in one disappointing spill, and she was just crying, sobbing, looking up to see the canvases of her paintings sneer at her, mimicking her suffering, along with the chants of we're alive, resonating from her laptop, her dead children surrounding her in jars. I knew what I had to do. I told my wife to dress herself. I dropped her off to the neighbors, and told them to watch her. Then I went back, gathered the canvases and the jars. I went round to the backyard to grab a shovel before I shoved them all into the trunk of my car and I hit the gas pedal. I drove, far, far away, away from the house, the city, and into the country. It didn't matter where it was, and I drove wherever there was a large density of trees. I tried to maneuver the car as far into the forest as I can, and, once I'd gotten far enough, I got out of the car, fetched the shovel and began to dig. I dug as wide and as far as I could, wanting to bury the jars and the canvases. Preferably I would have liked 6 feet under, but it felt as if something was crawling through my skin. It felt like a child's hand squirmed to grasp at my shovel and pull it away, and I screamed every time it slipped out of my hands, convincing myself that it was sweat and it wasn't dead children, and, in my political view, they weren't developed enough to be children, but it really felt like some sort of childish spirit was clawing at me, begging for me to stop. Suddenly, it was so hard to dig and some sort of buzzing reached into my ear. Suddenly there was someone, or multiple people, chanting for me to hear, ghastly whispering, we're alive, we're alive, we're alive. No you're fucking not, you're just a bunch of lifeless cells that ruined Catherine's life, I said aloud, and I began to dig faster. The voices just got louder and louder, accompanied by slow screeches, before it got louder and I heard Catherine screaming in agony at some point, we're alive, 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 we're alive. I threw the shovel away and got to my car, popping open the trunk, and Catherine's painting met me. The woman in acrylics seemed to screech at me, seething and crying, as if I was about to kill her, her mouth agape with the ugliest of teeth. I grabbed the paintings first and threw them into the hole I dug. Then I went back to snatch the jars and I threw them into the ground, the glass shattering and its contents spattering into the earth to be laid to rest. We're alive. 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 I picked up my shovel again and I quickly shoved the dirt back, burying the shattered jar remnants, the blob of jellies that could have been my children, the paintings of anguish. As I closed up the hole, the shouting seemingly began to die out, and with its final sigh, it ceased into silence. I have come a very long way. That was all 5 years ago. I could not describe to you the heartbreak it brought me, the heartbreak it brought to my wife. The loss we have suffered have been devastating. As long and painful our journey was, we have learnt a lot from it. After burying the remnants of the miscarriages, I took Catherine to see someone immediately. I'm glad to say that Catherine has improved greatly, and what's a story to tell without a happy ending? A few months afterwards, we tried again, when the doc and I was sure she was finally stable enough, emotionally and physically. Initially, we didn't have much hope at all and we were prepared to look at other options we have not considered, but we miraculously pulled through, and now we have a beautiful girl. Catherine and I named her Charlotte, and she's a perfect little thing. She's almost 4 now. She's a happy little girl and she brightens up our days. Catherine and I are trying to get her a sibling. Please pray for us so it all works out. Although, this peculiar thing happened the other day. Just as we were all about to go to sleep, little Charlotte pulled me into her bedroom, telling me that she has a secret. Just to humor her, I followed her into her room and asked her what it was. "They alive?" she said, in a voice purposefully hushed to make it sound mysterious. I laughed and I asked her, who was alive. Then she pulled out this dirt-covered jar under the bed, its individual glass pieces taped together from its obviously former broken state.